Twins born with rare deformities. What happens when bloodlines are trapped within the same family tree? The hidden cost of inbreeding has scarred history with stories so haunting that they feel closer to legend than fact. Yet these stories are real, and behind them lie the devastating consequences of human isolation, secrecy, and tradition carried too far. In the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, there existed a settlement so far removed from the world that time itself seemed reluctant to enter. Nestled in a steep valley where the sun often struggled to pierce through the dense canopy, this community lived according to its own rules, bound by kinship, land, and an unspoken distrust of outsiders. It was 1937. The United States was beginning to pull itself from the shadow of the Great Depression. Factories in the cities hummed again, and men once again walked to work instead of breadlines. But in the high ridges of Appalachia, recovery was little more than a rumor. Here, families lived as their ancestors had, bartering, farming, hunting, and clinging to traditions passed down since the first settlers had crossed these mountains nearly a century and a half before. Among these families was the Blackwood clan. To the outside world, their name carried a whisper of suspicion, a curiosity laced with unease. To neighbors in nearby towns, they were an enigma. They rarely appeared in public, and when they did, their presence caused murmurs. A family apart, a family untouched, a family cursed. Dr. Thomas Harrison, a historian at the University of West Virginia, would later write, "The Blackwoods existed as a social island within the mountains. They created their own community, rigid and insular, refusing to mingle with the world beyond their valley. Their name became synonymous with secrecy." The Blackwoods traced their lineage back to 1792 when patriarch Isaiah Blackwood first arrived. He was a stern man, suspicious of others, and convinced that the outside world was a place of corruption. To Isaiah, purity both spiritual and physical could only be preserved through separation. He carved a life in the wilderness and taught his children the same creed: never trust outsiders and never leave the mountain. Isolation soon hardened into tradition. The valley became not just their home but their prison. A dirt road wound its way up the mountain, often rendered impassable by storms or floods. For years it kept the Blackwoods cut off from the nearest town, which sat miles away. Out of necessity, family married family. First cousins, second cousins unions that to the Blackwoods felt natural, but to science carried risks that would not fully reveal themselves until generations later. Sarah and Joseph Blackwood were one such union. First cousins, they had married in 1915, sealing yet another link in the chain of consanguinity. To them, this was no transgression. In their world, it was simply continuity. They had grown up together, their cabins no more than a stone's throw apart, their lives woven tightly by blood and circumstance. Marriage was less about choice and more about inevitability. Their early children appeared, at least on the surface, to be healthy. They were smaller than average and slower to learn their lessons, but in the rugged Appalachian wilderness, such things could be overlooked. It was not until 1929, on the cusp of the Great Depression, that the cracks widened into a fissure. That year, Sarah gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. From the moment they entered the world, the atmosphere in the Blackwood household shifted. The attending doctor, summoned from town after urgent pleas, recorded his horror in his personal journal. The diary would not come to light until decades later, but his words remain chilling. "I have never encountered deformities such as these. Both children present with severely enlarged craniums, their limbs underdeveloped, their bodies frail. Neither appears capable of sustaining themselves, for their ability to suckle is compromised. I cannot, in good faith, assure the family of their survival. It is my belief that their condition arises directly from repeated marriages within the family." Contrary to his grim prognosis, the twins named Eleanor and Edward lived. Their survival, however, was not a blessing but a slow descent into tragedy. The years that followed revealed severe developmental delays. They did not crawl, did not speak, did not walk. Their heads continued to grow disproportionately, while their frail bodies struggled to support the burden. Dr. Melissa Carter, a geneticist at Johns Hopkins University, would later analyze the case. "When close relatives reproduce," she explained, The likelihood of recessive genetic disorders rising to the surface multiplies. In the case of the Blackwoods, these unions were repeated over multiple generations. What we see in the twins is the culmination of accumulated recessive defects manifesting in their most extreme form. The Blackwoods themselves did not think in terms of genetics. To them, the children were a test, a punishment, or perhaps simply fate. Sarah, their mother, was crushed beneath the weight of guilt. Her once bright demeanor dimmed into sorrow, and she rarely left the cabin. Joseph, one night in January, as a snowstorm swept through the mountains, isolating the valley in a cocoon of white silence, the Blackwood household erupted in chaos. Screams tore through the wooden walls, echoing across the frozen air. "This isn't natural! Look at them! Look what we've done!" Sarah's voice carried through the storm, desperate and broken. By morning, the storm had subsided. What it left behind was more chilling than the snowdrifts piled against the doors. Sarah and the twins were gone. The only trace was a set of footprints, trailing from the cabin through the snow, ending at the edge of a cliff. The family never spoke openly of what happened that night. To the community in town, rumors swirled. Some whispered that Sarah, overcome with grief, had carried her children to their deaths. Others believed she fled with them into the wilderness, never to be seen again. But the truth remained buried beneath layers of silence, shame, and fear. The tragedy marked a dark turning point in the Blackwood saga. Yet the roots of that night stretched further back, deep into the soil of history. To understand the twins and the fate of Sarah and Joseph, one must go back to Isaiah Blackwood himself, the patriarch who planted the seeds of isolation, who wove secrecy into the family's fabric, and who believed that purity could only be found through bloodlines kept close. And so, the story begins not in 1937, but in 1792, when Isaiah Blackwood carved his home into the Appalachian wilderness. He was not merely a settler. He was a man fleeing accusations, haunted by whispers of heresy, carrying with him a vision that would twist and darken across the generations. The story of the Blackwood twins does not begin in 1929, nor even in 1915, when Sarah and Joseph joined their lives in marriage. It begins more than a century earlier, with the figure who would come to define the family's destiny, Isaiah Blackwood. In 1792, the Appalachian frontier was still a raw, untamed wilderness. Forests stretched for miles, broken only by ridges and streams. Settlers arrived with axes, muskets, and dreams of carving out a life where few dared tread. Among them was Isaiah, a man fleeing not just poverty, but something darker. Historical records from New England describe him as a heretic, accused of spreading unorthodox beliefs and of disrupting congregations with teachings that blurred scripture and superstition. 3 different communities had expelled him before he vanished westward. Dr. Rebecca Johnson, an anthropologist who has spent decades studying closed communities, notes, Isaiah Blackwood is a textbook example of the charismatic patriarch. He created an ideology around isolation, teaching his descendants that outsiders were dangerous, corrupt, and unclean. This worldview, enforced over generations, became a cage for the family. What began as one man's paranoia became an inherited prison. Isaiah's writings, preserved in fragments within family Bibles and journals, reveal a man obsessed with purity. He believed that mingling with outsiders diluted not only blood but spirit. His solution was radical: remove temptation. He led his family deep into a secluded valley where thick woods and rocky slopes shielded them from curious eyes. Here he built the first Blackwood homestead, a 2-story log house that, over the decades, would expand into the sprawling main residence of the clan. The land itself reinforced their separation. The road into the valley was treacherous, little more than a dirt trail that turned into a river of mud in the spring and an icy death trap in the winter. Few visitors came, and those who did often turned back. Isaiah welcomed this. He encouraged his children to trade only sparingly with townsfolk, warning them of the dangers of contamination. By necessity, the family turned inward. Cousins married cousins, siblings raised children who were themselves destined to become the spouses of their relatives. At first, the effects of this insularity were subtle occasional stillbirths, a child born with a weak constitution, a tendency toward shorter stature or slower minds. These things were explained away as bad luck, misfortune, or divine testing. Few connected the dots. As generations passed, however, the consequences grew harder to ignore. Town records from the late 1800s contain cryptic references to the Blackwoods. One sheriff's report notes, "The Blackwood clan is known to keep to themselves. Sightings in town are rare. Children appear strange, often pale or misshapen. Locals whisper of curses, though it seems more likely the result of their refusal to mix blood with any but their own." Despite this growing reputation, the Blackwoods themselves showed little inclination to change. For them, the outside world was a threat. Their traditions, no matter how peculiar, offered safety. It was for most families such tragedies would have prompted soul-searching, perhaps even a reevaluation of tradition. But in the Blackwoods, they only deepened the sense of inevitability. Misfortune was seen as fate, and fate was God's will. To question it was to question the very foundation of their existence. Still, not all were blind. By the late 1920s, whispers of unease had begun even among the Blackwoods themselves. Some younger members questioned why they never ventured beyond the valley, why they could not look beyond their kin for marriage. But their voices were quiet, drowned out by elders who repeated Isaiah's creed, purity above all. The arrival of the twins was a moment of reckoning. When the doctor from town saw them for the first time, his horror was palpable. He had delivered many children in his career, but never had he witnessed such deformities. To him, the connection was obvious. These children were the product of generations of intermarriage, yet even his warnings fell on deaf ears. The Blackwoods listened politely, then retreated once more into their isolation. For Sarah, however, the weight was crushing. The twins were not just a burden of care, they were a mirror reflecting the consequences of her family's choices. Each day, as she watched Eleanor and Edward struggle, her despair grew. Joseph's reaction was colder. He saw the children as a shameful mark, proof of weakness, but also as a secret to be hidden. He ordered the family to keep outsiders away, to speak of the twins to no one. What little remained of the Blackwoods' contact with the town dwindled to almost nothing. In the eyes of neighbors, the family had simply vanished deeper into the mountain. Meanwhile, the twins grew, but only in age, not in ability. By 1937, they were 8 years old, trapped in bodies that could not support them, with minds that never formed words. They were dependent on their mother for everything. And as Sarah's depression deepened, the strain upon Joseph grew into resentment. Their marriage, already tested by hardship, frayed under the weight of the twins' existence. Arguments became nightly affairs. Relatives living in nearby cabins later recalled hearing Sarah's sobs, followed by Joseph's furious voice. Tension spread like frost through the family settlement, chilling every interaction. Then came that fateful January night. The snowstorm raged, winds howled through the valley, and inside the main house the Blackwoods reached their breaking point. By dawn, Sarah and the twins were gone. The mystery of their disappearance would hang over the family like a shroud for decades. But for historians and scientists, the tragedy of Eleanor and Edward was only one symptom of a larger, more insidious truth, the slow unraveling of a family trapped by its own isolation. To understand how this unraveling occurred, we must return again to Isaiah and to the doctrine he left behind, a doctrine that turned a family into a closed society and a valley into a genetic cage. The morning after the storm of January 1937, the Blackwood settlement was eerily quiet. The snow lay heavy across the valley, muffling every sound. When the family awoke, they discovered Sarah's bed empty. The twins' bedding, too, untouched since the night before. Only the door, left ajar, told the story of where she had gone. Footprints in the snow wound from the cabin, across the yard, and into the woods. They moved steadily, deliberately, as if Sarah had known her destination. The trail ended at the edge of a cliff overlooking the frozen river below. No bodies were ever found, no cries were heard in the night. Only silence. To outsiders, this might have prompted immediate alarm search parties, questions, investigations. But the Blackwoods were not outsiders, they were a family bound by secrecy. No word was sent to the authorities, no neighbor was informed. The disappearance of Sarah and the twins was swallowed into silence, another secret locked behind the mountains. For the Blackwoods, tragedy was not to be explained. It was to be endured. Still, the loss scarred the family. Sarah's absence left Joseph colder, more withdrawn than ever. He forbade discussion of her name, forbade mention of the twins. To him, they were ghosts better forgotten than remembered. But memory cannot be erased so easily. Whispered conversations carried the story through the cabins, passing from ear to ear until even distant cousins knew what had happened. And beyond the valley, rumors began to seep into nearby towns. Farmers and traders noticed the Blackwoods' absence from market that winter. Normally, even in the coldest months, they came down to barter furs and handmade goods. That year they did not appear. When questioned, one distant relative muttered only, "They've had a hard winter." Hard winters were common in Appalachia, but this one was different. In the spring, when the Blackwoods returned to town, they looked gaunter, more haunted. Neighbors whispered of tragedy. Some claimed Sarah had gone mad and hurled herself into the river. Others believed Joseph had driven her to it in one of his rages. A few went further still, suggesting something darker, that the family had taken matters into their own hands, ending what they saw as a curse. The truth was unknowable, but the rumors stuck. Dr. Thomas Harrison, who later studied the Blackwood case, observed, "In isolated communities, tragedy rarely remains private for long. Rumors fill the silence left by unanswered questions." In the case of the Blackwoods, those rumors became legend, feeding into the family's reputation for strangeness and secrecy. What was certain was this: after Sarah and the twins, the Blackwoods grew more insular than ever. Joseph rarely left the valley again. Other members of the family still traded in town, but their visits grew shorter, their words fewer. The sense of mistrust between the Blackwoods and the outside world deepened until the gulf seemed unbridgeable. For some townspeople, the Blackwoods became a cautionary tale. Parents warned their children not to wander near the mountain, lest they encounter the cursed family. Young men joked about seeing strange figures in the woods, half-formed children with swollen heads and pale eyes. Whether these stories were born from imagination or distorted sightings, no one could say. What science now tells us is that the Blackwoods were living in what geneticists call a closed gene pool. Over generations, recessive traits harmless when carried by one parent combined and expressed themselves in devastating ways. Hydrocephalus, seizures, learning disabilities, malformed limbs. Each new generation bore the compounded risks of those who came before. Dr. Melissa Carter explains, "Think of a deck of cards. In a diverse population, the deck is constantly being reshuffled, new combinations bringing strength. In an isolated population, the same cards are dealt over and over. Eventually, harmful combinations appear, and without fresh blood to dilute them, those combinations repeat and intensify." The Blackwoods were not the only family to suffer this fate. Across history, from European royal houses to remote island tribes, inbreeding has left its scars. A few examples were as stark as this hidden Appalachian clan. By the 1940s, the Blackwoods had become almost mythic to nearby communities. Outsiders occasionally ventured toward their settlement, drawn by curiosity or rumor, but they were rarely welcomed. A dirt road, rutted and overgrown, led to the valley, but the Blackwoods guarded it fiercely. Some visitors were turned away with cold stares. Others, more persistent, claimed to hear strange cries echoing from the woods at night, sounds too human to be animals, but too distorted to be ordinary speech. The county authorities occasionally made note of the family, usually in passing. School records show only a handful of Blackwood children ever enrolled, and most were withdrawn within weeks. Medical records are sparse, with only a few visits logged by local doctors, usually under urgent circumstances. The Blackwoods lived, married, and buried their dead almost entirely within their valley. Meanwhile, stories of the twins lived on. Though no one outside the family had ever seen them, their legend grew. Some claimed they had survived and wandered the woods like spirits. Others insisted Sarah had killed them to end their suffering. With no evidence, the truth was left to speculation. What is clear is that their disappearance marked the beginning of the Blackwoods' decline. Over the following decades, births within the family became fewer, but stranger. Children born with cleft palates, misshapen limbs, or developmental delays became more common. Some lived short lives. Others lingered into adulthood, dependent on relatives for survival. By the 1960s, the Blackwoods were a shadow of their former size. Many cabins stood empty, their wood rotting, their chimneys cold. The main house, once bustling with life, grew silent. The family line, once so fiercely protected, was dwindling under the very conditions meant to preserve it. And yet, even as the family withered, their legend grew. In the towns below, the Blackwoods became a story to frighten children and intrigued travelers. Journalists occasionally sought them out, hoping to uncover a sensational tale. A few succeeded in speaking to distant relatives, who offered fragments of truth mixed with myth. But the heart of the family remained sealed. It would not be until decades later, when historians and scientists began piecing together medical records, oral histories, and genealogical charts, that the true story of the Blackwoods and the tragic twins would finally emerge. But in 1937, in the wake of Sarah's disappearance, the Blackwoods knew none of this. They lived only with their grief, their shame, and their silence. And from that silence, a legend was born. By the time the mid-20th century arrived, the Blackwood name had become more rumor than reality. The family still lived in their secluded valley, but their numbers dwindled. Birth rates fell. Deaths mounted. Cabins that once housed bustling households now stood empty, roofs sagging beneath years of neglect. Isolation, once their strength, had become their undoing. County records from the 1950s note only a handful of Blackwood births, many accompanied by reports of complications. One infant was born blind, another with a severe cleft palate. A boy lived only 3 days, his lungs too weak to sustain him. Others survived but bore the marks of the family's genetic burden: limps, twisted spines, seizures, or minds that remained childlike well into adulthood. For the townspeople below the mountain, these stories only deepened the Blackwoods legend. The cursed family, they whispered. Children dared one another to walk the old road toward the valley, their imaginations filling the woods with half-seen figures. Adults spoke more cautiously, some pitying the family, others shunning them entirely. Meanwhile, the modern world pressed on. Highways carved through the Appalachians, electricity spread to remote farms, and radios carried voices across states. But the Blackwoods remained apart, their valley a pocket of the past, frozen by tradition and fear. The outsiders. In the 1960s and 70s, a new kind of visitor began arriving: researchers. Anthropologists, sociologists, and later, geneticists sought out the Blackwoods, drawn by whispers of an isolated clan that had resisted modernity. Some were turned away. Others, after years of persistence, gained access to fragments of the family's story. Dr. Rebecca Johnson recalls, "It was like walking into another century. Lanterns lit the cabins, water was drawn from wells, and the people, many of them, looked decades older than their actual age. Some stared blankly, unable to communicate. Others moved with difficulty, their bodies bent and frail. It was clear this was not just poverty or lack of education. Something deeper was at play. Blood samples and medical records, where available, confirmed what many suspected. The Blackwoods were a textbook case of multi-generational inbreeding. Harmful recessive genes, normally masked in diverse populations, had risen to the surface again and again, producing a cycle of deformities, disorders, and premature deaths. Dr. Melissa Carter explains, "The tragedy of the Blackwoods is not that they chose isolation once, but that they reinforced it over centuries. Each generation." By the late 20th century, the Blackwoods were almost gone. A few distant relatives married outside the family, breaking Isaiah's doctrine and moving away. Others remained in the valley, clinging to the old ways, but their numbers dwindled year by year. By the 1990s, only a handful of cabins were inhabited. The once imposing main house stood empty, its windows broken, its walls sagging. The family that had once prided itself on purity had withered into obscurity. The Blackwood name became less a living identity and more a legend told in whispers, written in footnotes, and studied in classrooms as a cautionary tale. The legacy of the twins, and yet, the story of Eleanor and Edward, the twins born in 1929, remained the most haunting chapter. Their survival, against all medical expectation, forced the family to confront the reality of their choices. Their suffering exposed the cost of Isaiah's creed, and their disappearance, swallowed by a snowstorm in 1937, cemented the family's reputation as both tragic and cursed. To this day, no one knows exactly what happened on that January night. Some believe Sarah, overwhelmed by despair, carried her children to their deaths at the cliff's edge. Others suggest she fled, seeking refuge in some distant hollow, though no trace was ever found. The lack of evidence ensures the mystery will never be resolved. But perhaps the details matter less than what the story represents. The twins became symbols not only of the Blackwood's decline, but of the devastating consequences of inbreeding when isolation is carried across generations. Lessons from the past. The Blackwoods were not unique. History offers other examples: European royal dynasties plagued by hemophilia, island tribes stricken by congenital disorders, small towns where cousins married cousins until the gene pool collapsed. The science is clear: human survival depends on diversity. Where bloodlines are narrowed, disease and deformity inevitably follow. The Blackwoods simply lived this truth in a way so stark, so hidden and so tragic that their story resonates even decades later. Dr. Johnson summarizes it best. The Blackwoods show us what happens when fear and tradition override adaptation. They remind us that no family, no matter how strong, can survive alone forever. Isolation may protect in the short term, but in the long term it consumes. The Haunted Valley. Today, little remains of the Blackwood settlement. Nature has reclaimed much of the land. Trees grow through the foundations of abandoned cabins. The main house leans precariously, its timbers rotting, its roof collapsing under decades of neglect. Travelers who venture near say the valley feels heavy, as though the land itself remembers the sorrow it witnessed. Locals still tell stories. Some speak of hearing cries in the night echoing across the hills. Others claim to see pale figures at the edge of the woods, vanishing when approached. Most dismiss these as folklore, the echoes of a community that once lived apart and paid the ultimate price for their isolation. But the truth, stripped of myth, remains haunting enough. The Blackwoods were real. Their choices were real, and their fate stands as a tragic testimony to the dangers of closing a family, a community, or a bloodline off from the world. The final word. The story began with Isaiah in 1792, a man convinced the outside world was corrupt. It ended 2 centuries later, with a family reduced to whispers, their homes abandoned, their name a shadow. In between lay generations of silence, secrecy, deformity, and despair. And at the center of it all, 2 children, Eleanor and Edward, whose lives and deaths became the darkest symbol of the Blackwoods' legacy. Their story reminds us that history is not only written in books or carved into monuments. Sometimes it lingers in forgotten valleys, hidden in abandoned houses, and whispered in the wind. Sometimes the most disturbing chapters are the ones no one was meant to read.